I'd extend gratitude to New Song for hosting us today again. We're going to go ahead and start with just a round of check-ins and a check-in question. So we'll go ahead and share our name, our pronouns, and then the check-in question for today is, what is a quality that you are bringing to today's meeting? So we'll go ahead and start with virtual participants and then go in person. Amarachi, do you mind kicking us off?
Can I get a moment to think about it?
Yes, absolutely. Jamie or Kamala, would either of you start us off?
I can start. My name is Jamie Levy, and I use she and her pronouns. I say I bring a desire to build a better future for children and families.
Hi, I'm Kamala Hurst. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm trying to interpret quality. So I'm going to guess that thoughtfulness is a quality that I bring to the discussion.
Hi, I'm Amarachi. I use she, her pronouns. I would say what I bring is my skills at strategic planning.
Lisa, do you mind starting us off on the in-person round, and then we'll go around?
Okay. Oh, you guys forgot
and Dean, sorry, Dean.
Yeah, my camera quality isn't that good, but here's like me in our living room right now. So, and so one quality that I'm Dean Salazar, and one quality I bring is hard focus and accountability.
I'm Lisa Whittorf. I use she, her pronouns, and I bring knowledge about the needs of children in our community.
I'm Kathy Pedersen, she, her, and I hopefully will bring some general grants, administration, and project management. Yeah.
I'm Lisa Pellegrino, and I use she, her pronouns. So let me lower this down. And I am bringing curiosity today.
My name's Katrina Peterson. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm hoping to bring presence and grounding today.
Good afternoon. My name is Meg McElroy. I use she, her pronouns, and I am bringing worker bee energy.
Hello, I'm Erica Bridgman-Bugnoli, she, her pronouns, and I bring active listening skills.
Good afternoon. Lene Johnson here, she, her pronouns, and I bring, I'm going to say two, because I liked two, curiosity and thoughtfulness.
Hi, everyone. My name is Stephen Pham, he, him pronouns. I'll share two as well because one of them was curiosity. I love asking questions. And I would say the other is excitement. I went through the pre-work this morning and was excited to see a lot of our work and with the community council coming together and seeing, you know, the fruit of our labor. So excited.
Fantastic. So I have a quick update about Amy before we proceed on. Amy will actually be stepping away from the council this year. And we just wanted to express our gratitude for all of the labor that she contributed to the formation of the council this past year. And we wanted to flag that we have an alternate lined up from the last recruitment process. And so we've extended the invitation to them to join, and we're hoping that they'll be able to join by the next meeting. So at this point, we're going to go ahead and move into orientation, and I'll go ahead and kick it over to my colleague Meg to talk about where we have been.
All right. Thank you, screen share. Thanks, Yisheng. So just a little bit of a reminder. We are sharing this graphic, which you have seen before, to remind us sort of where we are in the process and where we're headed. So The blue arrow shows you where we are now. As you can see, we have already started the community engagement process. You all, in the spring, developed that, and it's in implementation phase right now. The surveys that were out in the community are done. There's focus groups that are being completed and interviews. That analysis is happening, and you will be hearing more about that in May. So on the arrow, like I said, where we are now is the focus on developing the application and review process, as well as eventually the process by which this council will give recommendations on grants to fund. This past fall, September and November, you worked really hard on framing up key issues in the application process, application questions. And we did some brainstorming at our last meeting in November around the review process. So we're going to revisit both of those topics today, and Katrina will orient you to where we're headed. Our next few meetings, we will focus on the community engagement results, and eventually you all will recommend funding priorities for the Levy's 6 program areas out of those results. And then staff will start preparing the grant-making process to open up this fall. Any questions on sort of the big picture steps? All right.
Nope.
Great, thanks.
Okay, so I'll go ahead and orient us to the work that we're doing today specifically. So big picture, we're hoping to get your feedback on the application and how to continue to improve it, as well as the scoring criteria in the review process. The specific outcomes that we're hoping for today are listed up above. We want your feedback on the application scoring criteria, suggestions for how to improve the application, your deeper kind of strategic thinking about how to address the grant review process considerations, and then your ideas for how to conduct the review process. We're going to do a combination of small group work to large group work today. And the focus will be on a lot of idea generation. We're going to have breaks. We're going to have 2 breaks, one 10-minute break at 2:20, and then one 5-minute break at around 3:10. And then from the work that you all generate today, the staff is technical difficulties in the room once again. So the staff is going to take all of your feedback and the ideas that you've generated, and then in conjunction with the feedback that we're gathering right now from current and past and prospective grantees, we're going to finalize the application and the grant review process. I want to start off by acknowledging that this is a lot of content to cover today, and that we won't have time to dig into all of the details. And so our hope is to take a moment to step back and evaluate the big picture and if we're going in the right direction. Does anyone have any questions about where we've been or what we're doing today?
I don't know if this is exactly.
Do you mind putting your mute?
I don't know if this is exactly on topic, but was a rubric used in the past for scoring?
Meg, do you mind if you take this question? Lisa was asking if there was a rubric used in the past for scoring.
Yes, there was a score form, and I wouldn't necessarily describe it as a rubric. There were a set of criteria. Many of those criteria were adapted to align with the draft application that you all will work on today. And in the past, the form was set up so that there was a total number of points for each sort of different set of criteria. And so it would sort of prompt the reviewer that something was worth up to 2 points or up to 6 points. And so the reviewer could give as many points toward that top end as they saw fit. And they did have training last time on sort of how to use that. So the version that you all are seeing today is a slightly different take on that because it is a bit more of a scale and everything is on sort of a similar range of point values. Does that answer your question, Lisa?
I think so, yeah.
Okay,
Enough for now, anyway.
great, thanks.
Does anyone in the virtual space have any questions? No? Okay. Okay, well then Meg, I'll kick it back over to you to kind of set up the conversation about the first part of today, which is where we're going to focus on scoring criteria and the application review.
All right, great, thanks. So just a reminder, our intention with the application is to work on simplifying it. That was sort of what was identified from feedback from our last round of grant making in 2019-20, and that feedback came primarily from grant reviewers. They spent a lot of time reading each application and using the scoring form to sort of understand how to score an application. So it's really their impression that things could be simplified to arrive at a good application without asking an applicant to do so much work. Applicants themselves had other feedback, not so much about that, but other parts of our process. So this is driven by reviewers, but also us as a staff. Sort of we saw this as an opportunity for ways to improve our work. So with sort of that in mind, simplifying the application, you all worked on the application 2 times already. Sort of in September, you did some big picture brainstorming on the kind of key qualities we would want to understand from an applicant organization, and then what you would really want to know about the program they want funded. So we took that brainstorming, we aligned it with our old application, we kind of cleaned it up, our old application, to fit with your brainstorming. When you met again in November, you went through that with a bit more of a fine-tooth comb and gave us some great suggestions to further simplify. And so now here we are today with another version of that application, along with a set of scoring criteria. So you hadn't seen that yet. That's new. And like I said, we used the scoring criteria from the 2019-20 funding process and adapted it to the questions that kind of arose from your last bit of work. That draft that you all are going to work on today is also right now out in community. It has been sent to over 300 people associated with over 160 potential applicant organizations. And we have a Google form survey that has some Likert score questions or Likert scale questions and an open-ended question with their feedback. So far, 33 people have responded, which is a really low response rate. At the same time, I will tell you that in general, people are not raising any red flags. The feedback is sort of, this seems to be headed the right direction. And I would say the most consistent piece of feedback they're giving us is around word count and sort of issues of sort of, from the applicant's perspective, like logistical. So we're putting those on hold. We're really still focused on the content, and that's what you all are being asked to work on today. Anything I left out? Any questions on sort of that framing before Katrina turns it over to the instructions?
Just a quick clarifying question. You were saying the word count that people had questions about, is that the word count that applicants are submitting or that we're expecting of them?
They're just saying that the application draft that they saw has no instructions right now around word count, and that was intentional. We're really focused on, do these questions make sense? Do they seem like the right kinds of questions? Are they fair? And are these criteria making sense to you? Do they seem like the right criteria that go with the questions? Do they seem fair? That was kind of the gauge we were trying to get from potential applicants. So those finer details about sort of application requirements, like how long can this be? How many words can I write about this thing? We haven't put that out yet.
Okay.
I have a.
Yes, I do have. Oh,
Go ahead.
I do have one question. Just can you elaborate on what they meant by logistical? That's all I'm asking.
That's a great question, Dean. Thanks. By logistical, I mean sort of the steps that an applicant has to take to submit an application. How long could the application be? Will it be a document that they have to write on paper and upload to a online platform, or will it be an online application? So there are sort of like the mechanisms by which an application will come into the levy, and those kinds of questions are not yet answered. We're working on those. We're still focused really on the content of the application questions and how we're going to score responses. Does that answer your question, Dean?
Yes, thank you.
You're welcome.
My question is about the prior version of the application, which I know the staff has intentionally not given us as to not like bias our opinions, which I think that's a helpful approach for sure. I'm curious if you can just give a high level overview of like the differences, right? Like I'm curious if this ended up being shorter and feels simpler, or does it have the same number of questions? Yeah.
That's a great question, Stephen. And actually, I missed that in my talking points when I was orienting you all. So thank you for that prompt. You all did see kind of a version of it because in November, what we did was take your brainstorming from your September meeting and sort of like we called it crosswalking it to our old application. So you've seen a lot of the ways that we ask questions, and you all really weighed in on ways to simplify and combine. But to give you an answer sort of at that higher level, we reduced the number of questions that the application asked. We removed tables. We offered multiple choice and checkbox responses. We removed the demographic form for clients and staff of an organization and offered more narrative opportunities for that kind of information. We removed the line item budget form, and we wove the focus on racial equity and inclusion throughout the application. As far as page numbers, whether it's shorter, that's a great question. Our old application was in a 12-point font, and this one is in 14-point font for increased accessibility. However, we don't yet know if our entire application is going to be needing to be done on a city-sanctioned platform for grant applications. So kind of how it looks right now is we're not going to get too worried about that. We really still want to dig into the content. But does that answer your question?
Yeah, that's super helpful, and thanks for the reminder. I recall hearing portions or seeing portions of the application.
It looks like Kamala has a question.
Yeah, I was wondering if there's an incentive to fill out the survey or other scenarios to incentivize more people filling out the survey.
That is a great question, and unfortunately, we cannot provide, by city policy, gift cards. So we don't have a way to provide an incentive to potential applicants to fill it out. We're hopeful that the incentive is they can influence how the grant application and the scoring criteria are structured.
Okay, I'm not seeing any other questions, so I'll go ahead and move on. So I'm just going to go ahead and set up the activity, and then we're going to go ahead and break out and start doing some work together. So we're going to go ahead and move into a period of doing small group work. We're going to do 3 groups of 3 to 4 folks, and you're going to work through the 3 prompts that you see on your agenda in those small groups, and you're going to have 15 to 20 minutes for each question. So it'll be a total of around an hour or so in that small group. And then at the end of that small group work, we're going to come back together as a full council, and then you'll report out your top 1 to 3 suggestions to either improve the application and or the scoring criteria. In your small group, if you can select one person to report out at the end, that would be fantastic. And then there will also be one staff member in every small group there who will be taking notes for the small group. And then in terms of the prompts, you can read them on the agenda, and I'll just verbally read them out as well. The first question that you'll have about 20 minutes on is on scoring criteria. So we want your feedback on the scoring criteria. Are there criteria that you don't want, and are there criteria that are missing? The second prompt, and Yuxing, thank you for screen sharing those, is on point distribution. So we're wanting to know generally, does the distribution of points across the 3 sections, the program section, organization, and budget section, does the overall distribution of points reflect your priorities? And then within each section, does the distribution of points reflect your priorities? And then the third and final prompt will be, what 1 to 3 changes do you suggest to improve the application? And we're hoping that you can focus on big concepts if possible and not detailed edits. Throughout all the small group work, I'll go ahead and provide 5-minute warnings for all of the groups so that you get a heads up when you're going to transition. And yeah, does anyone have any questions about the activity before we go ahead and break out?
Just to clarify,
Yeah.
So we have a lot of forms here for the folks that are in person. So I know we have the section with the application and the scoring criteria. The significance of this other document for this conversation, or is this just for our own edification?
That will be for after break.
Okay, great. Thanks.
Yep. Okay, so the breakout rooms, let's see. We're going to have a combination of different kinds of breakout rooms. So there's going to be an all virtual room with Erica. And I was going to point you to where you can join Erica in person, but everyone will be virtual, so that's not necessary. It will be Amarachi and Kamala. You'll be with Erica. In person with Lisa, it'll be Lene, Lolita, and Steven. And then there will be a hybrid room with Meg, and that'll be Dean, Jamie, Kathy, and Lisa. And then if Alex, Lisa, you will be Lisa W. You will be with Meg. Okay. Yes. Yes. And then if Alex pops in, they will be with Erica in the virtual room as well.
Lolita? You mentioned Lolita?
Lolita, if Lolita comes,
Okay.
she'll be in person with Lisa. Yep. Lisa, staff person. Thank you, Lisa W. And Joel is working on the breakout rooms and will move you shortly. Okay, thanks all for coming back. So at this point, we're going to go ahead and do a full council share out of all the different conversations that happened in the small groups. So I'm just going to go around and I'm going to ask the lead from every group to go ahead and share out. And then I'm actually going to also share the feedback that I gathered from Karina. We did a one-on-one before the meeting since she wasn't able to attend, so I can bring her voice into the room as well. So I'll start off with that, and then I'll go to the virtual group. So from Karina, her feedback on these prompts. On the whole, she was sharing, and Meg is sharing the points up there as well, that the application questions encapsulated her values, the language is good and beautiful, the scoring rubric clear, and had a lot of small copy edits to increase the clarity of application questions, especially as she was thinking about the application from the perspective of folks who speak English as a second language. Was there anything else on there, Meg, or is that everything? Nope. Okay. From the virtual group, whoever is going to share out from that group, if you could go ahead and share.
Okay, since I was taking notes for that group, I have those notes. Okay, can you hear me now? It's green.
Maybe bring it even closer to you.
Usually, no one has any
Yeah,
problem.
that's better.
Okay. So they thought the point distribution was good, that the program organization and budget were clean, that it reflects what the council had raised, and that the second to the last section about research is less points. And then there was a big discussion about maybe having the section on collaboration being more points. The criteria was clear and detailed, but the suggestion was to have the part on collaboration be 20 points instead of 15. That kind of gets into the second part, so I don't want to skip ahead, but.
Were there any other points from that group that wanted to be shared?
For part one, no.
For the whole,
the whole
across
thing?
all of, yeah,
All
across
three
all of the
points?
work,
Okay.
yeah.
So 20 points for the collaboration. And then there was discussion about wanting to track whether new, ongoing, expanding program areas, like that's a question that's not a scored question, but wanting to be able to track that and track it over time. So as the levy gets, each time we do a funding round, seeing, look at what are the people who are applying new, what are they asking for? What does that look like? And is that changing? And then in the third part, there was a big discussion and not really an agreement that came to about whether or not they were happy about not having the question of how you will sustain the program after the grant ends. One person felt like we should add that question in. How are you going to sustain funding for this program after this grant is over, or that applicants should have some sort of sustainability plan? And the other member felt the opposite of that, felt pretty strongly that it should not be included. So we did not come to consensus on that. Let's see. Everyone thought having the criteria at the end of the application was really helpful. And they liked the new way the budget was constructed, thought it was better for reviewers. And then the last real change they wanted is section H. Felt like the way the question was asked about community voice wasn't clear. So maybe needing to rewrite that question so it was easier for the applicant to understand what was being asked.
H under program?
Yeah, the one about community voice, I think that's under program. Yes.
Folks who are in the hybrid group, would one of you mind sharing out your kind of top headlines across all three prompts?
Yeah. So our biggest changes that we'd recommend are creating a rubric so that the scoring is more like the most consistent. Simplifying some redundancies and highlighting the keywords for these questions. So felt like there was a lot of repetitiveness and it was difficult to tease out what they were asking. Reducing compound questions and more emphasis on experience, skills, and abilities to serve children and families. We felt like the children and families part kind of got lost a little bit. And revisiting some titles just to make sure they're aligning with the questions. And another one was, we only did this for the first section, but we had felt that our most important, or the one that should be weighted the most, would be section B, followed by C, then A, and then D. So just reordering which ones, and I don't think, point by point it matters, but just overall which ones have the most points. That was our priority.
And then folks who are in the in-person group?
Well, we don't have our notes, but our lovely note taker, our scribe, can help us. Overall, we're going to try to tag team this. But overall, one of the things that were, I guess, aligned with some of the other groups was the section about community voice, just starting there because that was in alignment. We do think that the language, if it's in the application, we want to be concise and specific. So like if there's words that are used in this criteria, we want to make sure those same words are used in the question, even though we'll provide the criteria. I think, for example, like the community voice question doesn't help someone infer how to answer that because it's subjective, right? So I think we need a little bit more symmetry in the language there. Overall, we did agree that the scoring of each sections were weighted a little bit how we would agree. So we think program should be the highest, but I think we agreed that budget should maybe be a little bit higher. We didn't come up with a tangible number, but we know that we talked about taking out or streamlining some of the budget questions, but we do think it should be weighted when talking about return of investment and outcomes for students and families. We want to make sure that those budget items are clear. and that they're important. Do you want to add in another section that we talked about?
Sure, and I think as we got into each section, we also were kind of thinking through, specifically, I think in program, how we might want certain of those subsections to be weighted a little more, like equitable outcomes or community outreach. I think we identified outreach and community engagement. And the other piece might also, in the organization section, we were wondering if it would be worth balancing the two first sections. So first is organizations' purpose, goals, and community collaborations, and then next is organizations, clients, community serve, staff, and leadership. We do think B is important, and we're wondering if we want to either add like a criteria or just ensure that that first subsection is weighted more equally.
Yeah, just given that the baseline of most of the questions are about the alignment of the strategic plan or the mission and goals of the organization, if that is necessary for each of the other sections, we think that that should at least be like maybe 20 points, just so that way the organizations understand if you provide this baseline information, obviously it'll help us moving forward down the application. And there was one other section that we...
I was going to add, sorry to interrupt.
Yes.
We agreed this, I don't think it was specified for our group, but this was my feedback, I can say at least. I did agree and said 20, I agree. So that can be written out. I did say I agree that the part, whatever part is the mission, goal, and collaboration, that should be 20. I brought that up. I don't think that was put in the notes.
I said
so I'm in agreement. But yeah, down to the points I said I guess like 20 was what I was.
We were around there too. 16 just didn't seem like enough. There was one other section. Was it outreach and community engagement where you talked about potentially adding more?
Yeah, I think because it's only 4 points right now, and the criterion itself is pretty meaty, so that might be good to just break into 2 and allow it to be 8 points instead.
And then I think overall, we just talked about streamlining the language that's used in the questions and being specific. I know in one of the questions or one of the criteria sections, it mentions strategic plan and or goals or plans, but strategic plan isn't listed in the application. Not necessarily saying we want to add strategic plan, because that could mean way more documents that come through, but just either taking out strategic plan if it's not necessary to be said. I know it says and or and a lot of slashes, but I think for some smaller organizations, right, a strategic plan is a pretty lofty task, and I don't want them to be like, oh, we need to update our strategic plan before we do this, right? Goals that they have outlined could be sufficient as well.
I wanted to say something. I wanted to say something that got left out. Under program D, the service activities, and E actually. D is just basically, did you fill out the application correctly? And it's supposed to be about what service activities they're going to do. And I think that instead of just filling out the form correctly, it should be, do these service activities seem to go toward the goal of whatever this organization is doing? And I got we had little voices saying, well, that's covered in E, but the question in E was, overall, the program activities, location, focus, curriculum are clearly relevant and responsive to the population served. And overall in this program area, I don't feel like there's any question about how did you decide to serve these people and how did you decide that there was a need. The thing at the top where it says summary paragraph clearly outlines the program and explains how the program addresses the PCL service strategy. Well, the thing is that some of those strategy, like what are the funding priorities, some are overserved and some are underserved. And so if it's in an overserved area, that might not be actually necessary for that neighborhood or whatever they're serving, that population. So I think it should be part of the criteria to say, is this really a need? and how did you decide that?
If I can add, Stephen and I talked about that with the community voice section. The two questions are different because it's like, has the population to be, or is the population that's to be served have a leading voice in identifying its need and deciding that it wants this program, which is what I think you spoke to, Lisa. But then the latter question is about how are you accountable to that? I don't think that the first question or the first criteria section is succinct with what the application is asking. So I think it's a difference of, is the community voice what informed your direction of this program, or are you not assessing the other programs, right? If it's oversaturated or if it doesn't. But and I think accountability comes after that, right? Like you can say the community, you're accountable to the community, but if they didn't inform what you're doing, then you're accountable to what, right? Really just kind of checking your own balances, I guess. But I think that section could be a little bit more clearly defined, maybe in the application, so that way it supports what we want them to say. But I do think there is a difference between the community informed our decisions and or we're being accountable to them. I think there's two different things. And then there was one other thing that I had a question from Erica's group. And we don't have to go on this because I know everyone didn't come to a consensus, but the question about adding, the question about sustainable funding after this program, I was just curious to know, did the group advise that that be added and include a score, or was it just out of curiosity to understand? So I was hoping maybe we could talk about that.
I'll let Amarachi or Kamla address that. They want to. I can't.
Amarachi, so do you want to do a pro con?
I let's do it. So to be fair, at least I can see from my end, I kind of I left being like, this is something I need to think more about, because I do think that, in my opinion, I think it's important to have a question that addresses the sustainability. But I know that the traditional way that that question is asked is just, it's doesn't really provide any useful information. So like the traditional way normally in grants, when they ask questions about sustainability, is like they just ask like, how will you sustain, how do you plan to sustain funding, right? And it's not really, it's like counterproductive, because really a lot of cases it's like, well, we're reliant on if or if not we get a grant, and so it just becomes like just regurgitating the same like standard stock response. And so I do think there needs to be that question. What I can admittedly say is I don't know how can that question be asked in a way that's like where it's beyond just that like not really productive question, but it's actually getting down to like, if you already have this funding, like, because if you were to be funded for like this many, like the amount of years, what is your plan, and what is your plan to sustain it outside of this funding or more? That's the thing. I don't know how the question is, like, it's kind of like in my head I know that's what I'm saying, I'm not sure. In my head I know that their question needs to be asked. I just don't know how and what that question looks like. So that's where I landed. I was just like, I need to think about this more.
And I was glad that it was not included for a couple of reasons. One, this is a 3-year grant, so you are getting a 3-year picture. They are showing us how they're going to sustain over 3 years. And then secondly, Erica pointed out that the average grant could be $300,000 over 3 years. Just knowing what the funding arena looks like, it would be pretty difficult to replace $100,000, especially over 3 years. So for me, I think it's kind of I don't know if I agree that there could be a question we could ask that goes toward like program sustainability beyond the 3rd year, but I don't think it's a financial question necessarily. So that's sort of where I landed on that.
Yeah, I agree. I think the sustainability thing is how you got what I was trying to say. I think that sustainability question is beyond just that stock answer of like I plan to seek out private and public funding, but instead of the question being like I do think sustainability does go beyond you got it. I was like in my head I was like I know that needs to be asked, but how? I think yeah, sustainability is still important. It's important to know that after, let's say, by the end of 3 years, that let's say the funding stops or continues on, how is it going to how how is it going to continue on as far as being like making sure it's like a successful program that it's meeting its impact. I guess that's already kind of already asked, but yeah, I think it's just how do you sustain the program as far as like maintaining the mission and vision
Thanks
and
for
being
that.
able to continue.
Thanks for sharing your thoughts on that. One of the things that I thought of when you mentioned that is, it's more so like us exploring their other streams of revenue, right? Not necessarily just how it's going to be sustained after this grant ends. And so maybe there's a question that we fold in to the budget section about other streams of revenue or other grant funded programs that they have, just to kind of get an understanding of what their capacity looks like as far as sustainability. But I do agree with Amarachi in saying that like sometimes the questions that we ask may not evoke the responses that we want. And so also in thinking of in the end of 3 years, a typical nonprofit, like you constantly have to apply for grants, like all the time. And I know that from a lot of the grantees that I work with, like grant writing or a grant writer, a full-time grant writer is not accessible to everyone. And so it just feels unrealistic to be like, so tell me how you're going to sustain this, when they're like, I don't know, I'm probably trying to figure that out too. So like, how do we not word it in a way that's punitive or make them feel like they need to have more of a robust answer, rather than getting them to think strategically about like, okay, what does my current revenue streams look like, and how can I start thinking about that versus expecting them to have a solid, like, oh yeah, we're going to get another $100,000 in 2027, right? We don't know that. So
Can I add?
I'm going to go ahead. We're going to go ahead and end after Kathy's point, just a heads up, and then we're going to go to break.
I would, 3 years is a really short period of time, I think, to have, you have to do all this work, you have to start up, do the work, collect the data, compile it, and it's at the end of 3 years that you see your impact. And then if you apply for a grant, then it takes another year to get it. So it's really hard. I think that's a hard question. I agree that to say, sure, we're going to, but I don't know how we won't know the impact till the end. So I'm wondering if, something rephrased or, I don't know. And then like you said, nonprofits, they don't have a grant writer or people that are just constantly chasing money. Maybe they do, I don't know. But anyway, I just want to add that.
Okay, folks, I know we could probably go on for longer on this question, and we're going to just have to pause so that way we have time after break to talk about the grant review process itself. We're going to go ahead and take a 10-minute break right now, so you can go ahead and come back at 3:30 or 2:44. 2:44. We'll see you then. space, if you want to come back onto camera or give us a thumbs up in the chat, just so that way we know you're here. The second part of the meeting is going to focus on the grant review process this time. And so I'm going to go ahead and kick it over to Meg, who's going to give a little bit of context and history before we get into the activity itself.
Thank you. All right. So there's a screen share happening with a slide that has the sort of headlines of what I'm going to say. So you all may remember back in November, we talked pretty briefly about the past process that we have used for grant review and scoring, which has always been recruiting community volunteers to review and score Levy grant applications. So some of the successes with that is that we've had great luck recruiting a diverse pool of folks with lived and professional experience in our 6 program areas and with experience with racial equity, diversity, and inclusion work in organizations and programs for children and families. Last time around, we provided volunteers with stipends, we provided them training, we were staff support to their work. There were 5 reviewers per application, so we recruited over 65 volunteers. And then their scores are averaged, and that is how a score last time was given to an application. And the biggest challenge that we encountered was variation in scoring. When you have 5 people looking at an application, you will have 5 different opinions, even when you give them lots of training and support. So the challenge with us, though, is that it was hard sometimes to see an application where there was 20 points difference between one reviewer and another.
Can I ask really quickly on that point?
Yes.
Was there anything that you did when you saw such a wide variance, or did you just still average?
We just averaged them, and a lot of times that was having 5 people and averaging their scores was the best way that we could kind of come up with to mitigate sort of outliers.
Okay.
But we didn't want to say that that wasn't a challenge. It is a challenge. So with that in mind, Katrina has designed an activity for you all to dig into our review process.
Okay, so we're going to do something similar to the last round of work that we did. We're going to do 2 rounds of small group work this time. And this time we're going to go into small groups and then come back to full council and then go back out into the same small group and then come back to full council. And you're going to workshop 2 prompts. The first one is looking at that 4-page handout. If you came in person, you picked up a 2-page handout that says grant review process, considerations, and constraints. And then if you joined virtually, it should be in the email attachment that I sent out. So the first prompt is going to be looking at that document and asking you to pick out the review process considerations that are the most important to you and to focus your discussion on those. And we want you to look at that list, or if there are other items that didn't make it onto that list, you can add them. And we want you to generate strategies to address those considerations. So for example, one of the considerations is scorer bias. And so an example strategy to mitigate scorer bias could be to provide anti-bias trainings to all scorers. After you do that small group work, you're going to come back out to full council and you're going to share out the mitigation strategies that you generated. And then you're going to go back into small groups, and based off of all of the ideas that you've heard about how to address the grant review process, kind of considerations and constraints, we want you to generate ideas for what you think would be a good way to do the grant review process. And so you can also look on, I think it's page 3 or 4, where we kind of list out some of the constraints of the grant review process, where we talk about some of the constraints of using volunteers versus using contractors, and also the fact that we took off the combo volunteer and contractor option because it's just technically and logistically too challenging for staff to implement that specific combo for the reasons that you can see laid out under using contractors. And so then once you finish doing the small group work, we're going to come back to full group, and we're going to hear from all the small groups about the different ideas that they've shared out. And once again, if you can select a staff or a person from your small group to report out to the big group, and there will be a staff note taker in each small group as well. Any questions about the activity or the prompts? Lisa.
How many applications were there last year?
116. And it wasn't last year. It was in 2019-20, but I knew what you meant. But
Yeah.
just wanted to clarify for others listening.
And did the reviewers meet after they scored and discussed
They
scores?
They did not, because convening meetings with 5 volunteers and 10 groupings of them or 12 groupings of them is really difficult. And so trying to put everything together in preparation for decisions to be made, we did not do that. And in hindsight, we're glad that we didn't, because the pandemic rolled out at that time and it would have been a major challenge in getting everything done in time.
Any questions from virtual participants before we jump into small groups? Okay. So the breakouts will be a little different this time, so that way hopefully you get a mix with different folks. So the virtual room with Erica will be Dean, Kamala, and Jamie. The in-person group with Lisa P will be Kathy, Lisa W, and Lolita, or Lolita won't be here, so Kathy and Lisa. And then the hybrid room with Meg will be Lene, Amarachi, and Steven. You'll have about 20 minutes in small group. Okay, so we're going to once again go ahead and just share out the mitigation strategies that you all brainstormed in your small groups. And once again, I'm going to start off with what Karina shared in our one-on-one prior to this meeting. Meg, do you mind scrolling up just a little bit? You're all good. So there were 3 items that Karina wanted to flag of most importance for her. The first was reviewer bias. And so some of her strategies were implicit and explicit bias training and wanting to ensure that reviewers don't have close relationships with the applicant that they are reviewing to mitigate conflicts of interest. The second item of concern for her was reviewer transparency and safety. She'd prefer to have all reviewers be anonymous if that was possible, which would potentially allow reviewers to be more honest and candid. And then group size and management was her third area of concern. And she just flagged that her bias was to default to wanting more reviewers over fewer in terms of like the number of reviewers. And that she was also concerned about managing confidentiality. And so she suggested kind of a Microsoft Office Dropbox setup where there's permissions set in a way where users can't download documents, but they can only edit them within the program. So let's go ahead and pivot over to the virtual only group to report out.
Okay, it sounds like this group's feedback was pretty different from what we just heard. So I don't know. I'm not usually a person whose voice is too loud. The main thing, so the group felt that reviewer experience and qualifications was important. And so that was one of the strategies that was mentioned, but we spent most of our time talking about power sharing and decision making. That was something that everyone felt was really important. And in order to do that, given that people aren't coming together like in an actual convening. They talked about strategies of volunteer training around this idea in the context of what power sharing means. Trusting people who are closest to the issues to be problem solvers, and including a short blurb about each reviewer to increase transparency, which was put on the website. Let's see, that was what we spent. There was some discussion about the importance of reviewer accountability and making sure people are following through on all of their responsibilities, but we didn't really discuss strategies for that. Yeah, so that's the main gist of what we did.
Anyone in the virtual group have anything to add? Are we good to move on?
I thought Dean might have something else, because I think there was one point he had I didn't quite capture. But no? Okay.
Okay, let's go ahead and move on to the hybrid group.
So I'll start sharing, and then any of my friends from my group can add it if they like. So we focused on score variance, reviewer bias, reviewer experience, and qualifications. And I don't know if everyone else felt this, but I had highlighted ensuring all applications get similar treatment, which I think kind of goes hand in hand with reviewer bias. One of the things we talked about was implicit and explicit bias training for volunteers. We understand that like one workshop or one online training isn't going to solve everything, but we think it's a good start, and at least naming or normalizing that we know that we do this based on your own personal identification, whether that's race, group, or however you identify. Like, we just know that we don't want to remove everyone if they have personal experience to a specific group. Amarachi brought up an example like, oh, if I have a disabled child, I may have more affinity to a group that does disabled student services, right, because of my own personal connection. And not that that's a negative thing, it's just normalizing and naming what that is so that we were aware while we're grading or scoring rubrics. We talked about with score variance, I felt that 5 was a lot of reviewers per an application, and it creates opportunity to have significant variance in scores. And so I brought up a suggestion of some form of quality assurance for extreme variances in scoring. Like if on these examples, it says like 97, 95, 90, 89, and 72. Well, there's a huge gap between 72 and 97. And so wondering if there's someone on PCL staff or maybe some like super community volunteer reviewers that come in to do a little bit more investigation as to what the variance was. Because I think since all of the reviewers don't come together, there isn't an opportunity, it feels like, to identify whether there was bias or whether there was not enough information in said application. So I think maybe identifying a PCL staff person or a special volunteer that has additional training and can review to find out if there is some discrepancy worth noting. And I mentioned limit number of reviewers per application. I don't know if everyone else felt that, but we talked about if it were 4 or if we had 3 reviewers and there was kind of a huge variance, would bringing in an additional reviewer actually help, or will it just kind of make it harder to make a decision? So I don't know where we landed on number of people, but my personal answer to that is like maybe grouping so many volunteers per a set of applications, not necessarily that all 5 are reviewing the same applications. Maybe one volunteer can review 10, and then Steven's another volunteer who can review 10 and such. But I don't know if that speaks for what everyone else said in the group, but I'll pass it to see if there's anything anyone wants to add.
Thank you for sharing that. Covered, I think, pretty much everything we talked about. The only thing I would add, and this more so represents some of my thoughts that I didn't get, or we didn't have time to go into, touches on both like the number of reviewers. I recall that we weren't always able to have 5 reviewers. Some would fall off, and so that was difficult to have consistently applied across all applications, as well as we were talking about like quality control systems, like a different type of volunteer. I wonder if the compensation, which my interpretation is that all 75 volunteers were paid $250, maybe if they got all 5 applications, or was it, yeah, if they got to all 5, I wonder if we can just be more creative about like, you know, maybe the baseline is maybe like 3, and then you get paid per application you go over, or differentiating the stipend for a quality assurance type of volunteer who may have to go through more training and more work to like review different applications if there is wide variance. So, yeah.
I also meant to say that when we talked about reviewer experience and qualifications, saying that the importance of having a diverse group of experts in the room, right, helps, I guess, kind of eliminate instances of biases, right? We know that personal and lived experience is obviously something we want when we're talking about community voice and having representation across cultures and sectors in the room, but not hindering their ability to subjectively review the applications. I don't know if that makes sense. Like, we want their expertise and experiences, but not to cloud their subjective or objective judgment of the application.
And let's go ahead and head over to the in-person group.
So the first one is score variance. We talked about having maybe more reviewers and then dropping the high and low score. So if you had 7, or Kathy thought even up to 12 reviewers, just to help average things out. I think you could do it even with 5 reviewers. Like, I averaged this out. When you average it with the 72 and the 97 in there, it's 88.6, but when you take those out, it's 91.3, so it does make a little bit of a difference. And then, again, I like rubrics. I think that if you have a rubric that clearly says this is what we're defining this as, and I use kind of an example that we used in scoring scholarships, which was community engagement. So community engagement, there's no community engagement, there's occasional volunteering, there's monthly volunteering, or person has a job and has done completed an internship in their field, and so you have examples to look at to know how to score it. I think that can make for much more equitable scoring. I know it's a lot more work to put the application together. I recognize that. The next one we had, did you have anything on that? Okay. Was reviewer and experience and qualifications. In this, we talked about how it's important to value lived experience as much as you value professional experience, because the experience of people who are receiving these services is just really often overlooked. And I think it's probably the most important part. And the other thing we kind of talked along with this, which went along with, I think, one we didn't really mark, which was reviewer compensation, is maybe giving some kind of compensation for like $250 if you complete 5, but then each additional one you get $25 or something like that. Using volunteers is pretty much what we were talking about, was using volunteers. And ensuring all applications get similar treatment. It's pretty much the same thing as we said under score variance, is using a rubric, and also I think how you recruit your volunteers and train them is important. Point of power sharing and decision making. Did we talk about that?
No.
Do we have any notes on it?
What I have in my notes for that is that you talked about making sure, it's kind of what you said around qualifications, I guess, to some extent, but to be sure that you are having people with both lived and professional experience, and that they are equally valued in whatever selection process that there is for reviewers.
Reviewer group size and management of reviewers by staff. Kathy felt like there should be a larger reviewer group so that the applications could be reviewed by more people. And I felt the reviewer group's size, proportionate to how many applications you receive, seemed, like that's basically one for every two, seemed adequate to me. But of course, I think there'll be more applications this year, so it should stay proportionate. And again, I think that, to me, I feel like contracting with people could end up with a bias toward professional people, and I think people's lived experience should be highly valued.
And the reviewer group is interesting to me because I feel like for project management, for me, it comes down to scope of work, timeline, budget, those three things. And so when you have a reviewer, hopefully we have people that understand the budget part too, like they want to do all these things, but do they have enough staff to do it? And I'm not sure, hopefully that's part of the reviewer process, but so that's why I was thinking more reviewers, diverse reviewers, lived experience, professional in that area, and then maybe some technical financial people could review. But just my 2 cents.
Can reviewers ask for help or explanation on questions?
I mean, we've provided information, but we, not help, I would say, in the sense of helping
Like if
somebody
they
score
said,
something.
I'm not really sure what I would be looking for in the budget. What things should I be looking for?
Well, the training did go over that,
Okay.
And then the rubric, would ask specific, or the whatever you want to call it, the scoring sheet, whatever you want, the criteria, pointed towards specific things that we were looking for. So that was the extent of it, I would say.
Okay, I know that there are some burning questions and points to be made. I'm going to go ahead and pause this here so that way we have enough time to go ahead and do the second body of work. Do folks need to take a break, or are you comfortable moving on? I'm seeing nods here in the room. Does anyone virtually need to take a break, or are you all good to go along?
I was nodding because I don't need a break.
Okay.
Yeah, I'm good.
Okay, it looks like everyone's good to go ahead and continue. So we'll go ahead and continue. So we're going to go back out into the same small group that you were working in, and you're going to, based on the conversation that you've heard, we want you to generate potential grant review processes that kind of integrate the strategies that have been mentioned in the room so far. So once again, the virtual room with Erica will be Dean, Kamala, and Jamie. The in-person with Lisa will be Kathy and Lisa. And then the hybrid group with Meg will be Lene, Amarachi, and Steven. And you'll have about 15 minutes in this group. So once again, we're going to go ahead and share out what came from the small group conversation, and in particular this time focusing on your ideas for how to run the grant review process. So I'll go ahead and actually maybe we can share Karina's feedback to start off, and I can actually do it from memory. I think she was recommending in the one-on-one that I had with her that we go with a volunteer process. Maybe. I know that she wanted us to go with a volunteer process, and in particular, once again, her biases towards having more reviewers over fewer also showed up. So that was some of her feedback. Oh, yes, and then also offer an optional stipend. Okay, so we'll go ahead and pivot to the virtual group. So I think that was Kamala and Jamie. If one of you would mind reporting out.
I'll report out for our group. I just put a cough drop in, so I'm sorry. I have a cold. but our group discussed including training, implicit bias training at minimum, and potentially some training around philanthropy and trust-based philanthropy. And we also talked about, I think there's variance, but a personal preference is maybe less reviewers with more applications and a higher stipend. But I think there's also champions for a tiered system. If you review X amount, you get this. If you review this amount. I think that we also felt that it would be really wonderful if reviewers could be together, at least for that final decision point where they could hear who are the top applications and why. Where is there some muddiness? Maybe reviewers were scoring in kind of varied ways, and they could hear from each other about why that was, and that might convince some folks, oh, actually, I was misunderstanding this, or I didn't have the lived experience to understand X, Y, Z. And so there's an opportunity to update scores even. And so we just talked a lot about whether or not that in-person piece could be accomplished, knowing that if there's a large amount of volunteers, it is complicated. And then another idea that I personally threw out, and I'll ask Jamie if she has an idea she wants to share too, was if volunteers are organized by focus area, like housing or foster care, for example, that potentially folks who don't specialize in one sector could audit discussions happening in another arena, just to build out that community learning and connection. And I'll throw it to Jamie if she has thoughts she'd like to add.
I think the other, I don't have one on that. I'd have to think on that a little more, but was the compensation or the point, if there's a point distribution that's really large to average that, or if there's one that's so large that that's one that would generate or be flagged for like a follow-up discussion between the groups, but not necessarily like 20.1, but maybe if there's like a 40 point, or the exact number could vary. But if it's very large, it's important to come back as maybe a small group or a few people to discuss that.
And in your group, am I hearing correctly that you're wanting to lean towards using volunteers?
I think so. We didn't discuss contractors, so that might be one way of saying.
Awesome. Okay. We'll go ahead and pivot to the hybrid group now.
We consistently have not selected a person to share, so I'll start us off and invite the others in my group. I think the few things that we might add are, we talked about recruitment and just the importance on, focusing there and ensuring we're bringing in qualified and diverse sets of reviewers. But Meg shared a lot of details on how recruitment has looked in the past. I think we heard this as well. We talked about like a midpoint check-in or some type of check-in where, going beyond the training, folks have an opportunity to come together, to ask questions, to hear what other people are going through, and to, create collective understanding as a group, as a way to reduce some of the variance as well. And I think Meg was pointing this out, also a way to increase accountability and make sure folks are on track with reviewing the applications. And then, I don't know what else.
So some of the things that we listed, we thought it was important to ask what's already in the training before just kind of assuming that those things weren't included. And so Meg shared that there is maybe about a 40-minute bias training that happens. And so one of my suggestions, as I wrote bias training on there, is like, how effective is that, right? Is there any section in the training that needs to be beefed up to ensure that it's clear and that folks are taking away what we want them to? And then I asked about debrief, or we brought up the option of a debrief with the group, and she mentioned that there are currently one-on-one check-ins with the reviewers for the accountability piece and to go over any questions or pain points that they may have. And so we suggested to try to create an opportunity for multiple group check-ins. We know it's not feasible to have like one day, obviously we can't all get here at the same time. So like we know that one day isn't enough. So potentially spreading out multiple check-in points so people can opt into the one that is that meets their availability, but also making sure it's communicated in the beginning that this is a requirement, just so that way it increases the opportunity for shared learning, but also gives the expectation that it's not just this one training and you're kind of off. It gives an expectation that we're going to circle back and make sure that we're addressing any outliers or any anomalies that come up. But I like, I don't remember who said it on the online, but she was mentioning like the shared learning piece, like even if that's not a focus area or a sector that the reviewer is familiar with, learning what came up for that one or how they inferred an application, I think would be helpful for future review processes. So I just think just coming up with a time for the group to debrief with each other and talk about not necessarily frequently asked questions, but things that came up frequently for the reviewers. Maybe it's something like, maybe Stephen reviewed an application and he didn't think about that, but hearing that I thought about it in that perspective may inform the way we both review applications moving forward. So we just think that it would be important to have some form of a shared learning or collective review. And then we talked about a quality assurance person for the score variances. We didn't really talk about specifically what that would look like, but I know I mentioned having a staff person or a super reviewer. But I think creating an opportunity to look at the outlying scores to say, oh, this one is 40 points up, what's happening there? I think if we only do that in silos, it doesn't help mitigate instances, or it doesn't help us catch bias, right? Or help us get to a consensus. If all 5 people are viewing this one specific section the same way, then we can assume there isn't bias there. But I don't think if we're not doing an analysis of how they got there, then how would we know if it's bias or just that person's own perspective?
And we didn't consider contractors. I think we just kind of assumed that volunteers would be the path forward. Amarechi, did we miss anything? Anything else you'd add?
No, I think everything that we talked about has been mentioned.
Thank you. We'll go ahead and go over to the in-person group.
I think almost everything that we said has already been said. We also agreed with volunteers, with increasing the stipend and paying additional for additional work. So maybe there was like a I'm just making up these numbers, a $250 stipend if you completed 5, and then if, $25 for each additional one or something like that. And I think that's about all we had that hadn't already been said.
Okay. Were there any last thoughts in the room that wanted to be shared on the process, on the point of the grant review process? Okay. Well, we'll go ahead and move now to starting to close the meeting. So we're going to start off with an evaluation. Meg, are you good if I kick it over to you? Absolutely. Okay.
Yes. For those of you who are here virtually, I'm going to put a Google form in the chat to give you some time to weigh in. And then for those of you who are here in the room, I've got a little handout to give you so that we will do a little reflection time that way. Any questions on that? A little different process.
And we have about 5 minutes. We'll play some tunes in the background for those who are present.
So we are good on quorum because Amarachi is on her phone with the camera turned on.
Today, the staff is going to take all the feedback that you've provided and we're going to integrate it into the scoring criteria, make application improvements, and figure out what sort of review process we're going to do. And then you can also expect a follow-up email from me after this meeting with a summary of the discussion findings, as well as any other attachments or invoicing forms, specifically for those of you who are joining virtually, who aren't picking up the forms in person. And then up on the screen, we have the next meetings coming up for to put on your radar. They should already be in your calendar, but just to go over them verbally. So that first meeting in May, on May 6th, that's going to be a joint meeting with not only the Community Council, but also the Allocation Committee. And at that meeting, Camille Trummer's team is going to present the findings of the community engagement work that's been going on this far. And this body, as well as the Allocation Committee, will have the opportunity to ask questions and discuss reflections on the community engagement results. And then based off of what we learn in that meeting, this council is going to come together on May 29th for about 4 hours. And we're going to ask you to develop funding recommendations for funding priorities in the Children's Levy's 6 program areas based off of the community engagement results that we've had. So that's a big meeting. We're excited to have your feedback and input at that meeting. Staff are going to take these recommendations to the Allocation Committee on June 24th for decision making. If you are here in person, you will have picked up an invoicing form. If you'd like to receive payment, just go ahead and fill that form out, and then you can leave it back on the table, as well as the evaluation form. You can also leave it on the table. And for those who are joining virtually, I'll go ahead and send those forms out to you as well. And then finally, we just want to end by expressing our gratitude to all of the council members. Thank you so much for your time and for your presence. We couldn't do this work without you, and really value your input and your guidance. So thank you. That's it. We're adjourned.
Thank you.
Folks.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.